Okay, so let's start. I'm very happy that I can introduce today Zsolt Czigányik from Eötvös University, Budapest, for our irregular lecture series as part of the Comparative Literature Department of this Institute of World Literature. Zsolt Czigányik is Associate Professor of English Literature in Budapest, and he's also the leader of the research group Democracy in East Central European Utopianism, funded by the Gerda Henkel Foundation at Central European University. He's also, by the way, the secretary of the International Utopian Studies Society. His research focus is modern utopian and dystopian literature. And recently, he published this very nice monograph with with Palgrave, yes, called Utopia Between East and West in Hungarian Literature, which we can send around, which investigates the utopian tradition in Hungarian literature. Today, however, he will talk about his new comparative project on Central European Utopia. He has emphasized that this is a work in progress, and he's looking forward to your feedback. So over to you, Zsolt. So Zsolt will talk for about an hour, and then we can have a discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much for this very nice reception I've received. I'm always a little bit in a difficult position because there seems to be such a high expectation for this talk that I'm only hoping that I can meet. But let's get started and we'll see what happens. So my idea of this talk is that this is Utopia in Central Europe, and both concepts in the title are complex and debated and complicated. So I'd like to talk about Utopia a little bit, then Central Europe a little bit, and then combining the two, a very small part of the huge panorama of Central European utopian literature. So starting with Utopia, I suppose I don't have to go into the basics. You probably already know that the word Utopia was coined by Thomas More in his book, which actually has a very complex title, but we refer to it as Utopia. This is from 1516, and the book was written in Latin, but this term is actually Greek, but it didn't exist in the ancient Greek language. It's a modern coinage. And the trick here is that it's spelled in the Latin alphabet as Utopia, but there are two Greek words here, Utopia or Utopia, which would either be, each of them would be spelled as Utopia. Thomas More actually refers to this ambiguity in his book. And EU means good, and OU means no. Topia is topos, is place. That's the simplest part, but it could be either a good place or a no place. And this ambiguity seems to be a part of the game, part of the genre ever since. Some people argue that the reason for the popularity of the genre, because it's a very popular genre, it's been around for 500 years, is actually this ambiguity, that it's never completely clear what you talk about, and it cannot be fixed in one position. Now, however, the history of Utopia doesn't really begin in 1516. The word, the concept, the word was coined then, but the concept is much older. It is, most scholars agree that it seems to be part of human nature. The wishing nature, it's a manifestation of the wishing nature of man. It's a kind of a, sorry, maybe I can put it somewhere else. Yeah. Oops. Oh. Actually, I cannot go back. Shall I hide it? Okay, now it's better. So, so this is, as you can see, I put a picture of the paradise. because the images of utopian images of a better world have been with us. Myths and images of the better world have been with us from time immemorial. You can find it in the Old Testament, but you can find it in even older texts. So that the world could be better than the one we live in. This is the basis of utopia, and also the idea that we can measure life by what it should be like is something very common. So utopian thought in its broadest terms is a tendency to think in alternatives. In everyday usage, we tend to link it to perfection. So utopian world is a perfect world. This is not very useful, to be quite honest, because perfection is not really a human category. Then nothing can ever be perfect. So if you claim that utopia is meant to be perfect, then immediately you also claim that it is impossible. It is something unachievable. If we use the term ideal instead of perfect, then we're in much better position. Something that is very important, that the fact that the alternative of the existing world, what I mean, social, political, and cultural aspects of our world, so there can be an alternative, that it means that the current order is contingent, meaning that it could be otherwise. So utopia is always the manifestation of the feeling, or very often hope, that the world could be otherwise. The world could be different. The world could be better. The world could also be worse, actually, but it could be better as well. Nothing is fixed. No social or political structure is forever. And the manifestations of this idea have been very complex. I put one example here. There are the paradise or the Garden of Eden is the best known, but also the kingdom of God from the Old Testament, which then carries on into the New Testament as well. But there are many other myths, the Golden Age myths from antiquity, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about utopian literature, then it was in the 80s and early 90s that a consensus appeared amongst the scholars, especially the American Lyman Tower Sargent spoke about the three phases of utopianism, so that utopianism being a larger category than utopia, because utopia is what we usually understand as the literary representation, so the literary manifestations of the utopian ideal. But there are some others. Beyond the literary manifestations, it's part of social and political theory. Actually, the two very often pretty much overlap. So, for instance, Thomas More's Utopia is understood as a piece of Renaissance literature, but it's also understood as a piece of social thinking, of political thought or political philosophy. But in social and political theory, utopianism is also present. The same Lyman Tower Sargent believes that every ideology has a utopia at its core, saying that if that ideology was to prevail in the world, then the world would be a much better place. Like there's a socialist utopia. We have experienced, some of us have experienced the communist utopia, but every liberals have their own utopia in the core of their ideology. But also, it has practical aspects as well. So communities, the best known are probably these days, what the first comes to my mind are the hippie communes of the 60s, and some of them carry on for long, like in Copenhagen. Christianopolis is still something of working, but you can think of the kibbutz in Israel, representing a different lifestyle, not as a literary work, not as a political theory, but as a community. There are many other small communities. I tend to put here the monastic tradition as well, because that's the idea, to live a different life than the mainstream, they live differently than the others. Actually, many of such alternative communities are with religious background, but not necessarily. Okay, so this is the what Lyman calls the three phases of utopianism. We'll be focusing on the literary aspect, but we better be aware that this is something more complex. I'd also like to draw your attention to a recent book by Gregory Claeys that was published just last year, Utopianism for a Dying Planet. So in this, he really gives a broad definition of utopia. Basically, he understands it as a timeless desire for human improvement, constant ongoing conversation about humanity's potential. So what he argues that it's something terribly important. It's not just a marginal or an eccentric idea, but utopia is what sums up humanity's highest aspirations. In his book, he doesn't only discuss the well-known literary utopias, but a lot of political ideas which are about to transform humanity. And this is what he emphasizes, that the main function is to offer a critical alternative to the present. So it's always a criticism. Utopia is always a criticism of the existing social and political reality, usually not in the form of some dry theory, but in the form of showing some kind of a fictive alternative. So that's basically the way I understand utopia. I must warn you that there are a couple of other ways of looking at it, and we could spend the whole afternoon and maybe tomorrow just to look at into every small aspect of the topic. So I just want to give a brief introduction into this. And now I would like to move into a term which is related and today very, very important, much actually in contemporary culture, much more strongly present than utopia, that is dystopia. That's the opposite. When I told you that the term utopia is about 500 years old, dystopia is much, much younger. A lot of people believe that it was J.S. Mill who first used the term in the late 19th century. This is actually not true. In English, it already existed in the 18th century, and it was mentioned several times, but clearly it was Mill who made it better known. However, just like utopia, dystopia existed before the term was coined. So this dystopia would be the kind of the negative counterpart of utopia. For instance, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, especially the last book, book 4, that's the book of Houyhnhnms, the intelligent horses. That's the only place where Gulliver would like to stay. He always wants to go home, but he doesn't want to go home from the horses. He's expelled. And Gulliver, as the narrator, has very high opinion of this land. Nevertheless, ever since the publication of the book, so roughly 300 years from now, there's been a debate whether we can really look at it as a utopia, or we should be reading it in an ironical way. And even though the narrator explicitly keeps claiming that this is a utopia, it's actually implicitly a negative utopia. So this is the first book where this appears, this debate. And as you can see, this is not necessarily crystal clear whether something is utopia or not. It's very much a question of interpretation, and that changes with time. Thomas More's utopia, for instance, for many of the readers today would be something not very attractive, too ordered, too much organized, too simple. Although some ideas I like very much, like they have the 6-hour working day. I think most of us would happily agree with that. But you can see that this has the definition has a subjective aspect to it, or at least the aspect of interpretation. It obviously changes with time. the great offer of Utopia is that everybody gets a decent meal 3 times a day and normal clothing. Even though, luckily for most of us, this is not a terribly attractive offer because we have it. In the 16th century, for most people, and actually globally speaking, for many people in the world, still it's a very great offer. But for most of us, it's not something that we would make us fiery and go ahead and try to reach it. So dystopia really became important in the 20th century, especially as you see that this is not purely literary issue, this is also a political issue. So with the rise of totalitarianism, Utopia became suspicious, particularly because some of the great totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, the fascists, the Nazis, and especially the communists also had this kind of utopian program. So the reform of the social and political world. And we experienced what kind of negative impacts it finally had. So basically, this disillusionment of all these, but mostly the fall of the communism and the negative aspects, negative experiences with communism came with a rejection of utopianism. But the first wave was actually the fascist and Nazi. So it was Karl Popper, for instance, in the mid-40s, who very strongly rejected utopianism, arguing that any kind of utopian idea is bound to be negative. It's bound to have very negative consequences. It took a lot of time for utopian scholars to argue that, come on, not necessarily. And as you say, if you followed from the beginning, we cannot ban, because that would be banning the idea of thinking about alternatives, banning the idea of hoping for the better. That's part of human nature, so that cannot go. But also, it's not only Karl Popper, also the conservatives were pretty much against utopias. For instance, Thomas Molnár, the American scholar with a Hungarian origin, believed that all utopias are negative because they are emphasizing the collectivity of humanity and the collective social ideas, and that's also a huge exaggeration. There are some collective utopias, but not all of them. So in any case, utopia in the mid-20th century was became pretty much a negative term. In most languages today, utopia is essentially a negative term. Utopia is something that, okay, it's nice, but it's unachievable. It's a dream, but a useless kind of dream. Is that the case with Slovakian language? That's if you hear. That's usually a derogatory term. Like if a politician puts forward a utopian notion, that is something you should not take seriously. But as you can see, utopia is something more complex. And dystopia is complex as well. So it looks very nice that you can put utopia here, dystopia there. There's a very nice binary opposition, but in reality, they're much more strictly connected together. Both of them represent some kind of criticism of the existing world. And actually, every dystopia also implies a utopia. If you read the dystopia, the most famous, George Orwell's 1984, you immediately, naturally find that this is not good. How should it be? So, and that's the utopia you build for yourself. So utopia and dystopia is always related with each other. They're not opposites, they're more like connected. So this is roughly how much I wanted to say about utopia. And then I'd like to move on to Central Europe. I think what we can agree that Central Europe is somewhere there on the map. But if we want to be more precise than that, then we run into a lot of problems. Would we agree that we are now in Central Europe? Right, that's okay. Okay, that's very good. So Bratislava, Slovakia are in Central Europe. I would argue that Hungary is as well. Maybe it would be difficult to try to give alternative maps of Central Europe, but if anybody would like to add a notion here, I'm quite free. But let me show you a few options. I found them on the internet. So for instance, this one. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that Switzerland is included in Central Europe, which is it's pretty interesting. Another big issue, even some of Eastern France. The Baltic states, that's always a recurring question, whether they're part of Central Europe or not. And in the East, it's very interesting. It's the west of Ukraine, which is included, mostly the former Habsburg Empire, and also the east of Romania, but not all of Romania. And in the Yugoslavia and the former Yugoslav area, it's only Croatia and Slovenia, not the others. So that's one option. I'm not claiming. My claim would be that it's when we talk about the boundaries of Central Europe, we're in a problem. Another one is very similar. What's very interesting, they say that it's a culture so the point is that when we're talking about cultural and political issues, and they don't completely overlap. They don't completely overlap here. They still have all of Germany and also a bit of France and Switzerland, without question. Also Northern Italy, a very small part of Northern Italy. We just spoke about Trieste this afternoon. I would definitely include some more of Northern Italy here. The Baltics are then culturally here. I'm not saying any of it is correct or any of it is incorrect. I'm just pointing you at the problems. But what is Central Europe? Does it make sense at all? So if we want to approach this issue, I think we have to start with the concept of Eastern Europe. And I still have a not very new, now it's going to be 30 years old, I think a very useful book on that is Larry Wolff's Inventing Eastern Europe. His idea is that Eastern Europe was invented. It was invented by Western Europe, and it's clear that we're not talking about geographical terms. We're talking about metaphors. North, south, east, west are cultural and political metaphors. For the geographically, it's a more simple question. His main argument that in the antiquity, there was the metaphor, the south represented something positive and the north represented the barbaric, the dangerous, the opposite of the south. The east was by no means a negative term in the antiquity. Ex oriente lux, the light comes from the east. Also, the fall of the Western Roman Empire really brought the rise of the Eastern Empire. Byzantium was really the center of the world. So the east by no means is a negative term in the antiquity. What happens, it's the centers of culture and economy are moving to the north, to France, to England, later to Scandinavia as well. And they just recognize they have a very problematic metaphorical structure here, because the north is barbaric and the south is culture. They have to invent something. And this is Larry Wolff's idea, that it was Western Europe, starting in the Renaissance, but really, really strongly during the Enlightenment, when they had to invent themselves as Western Europe at the center of civilization, and as an opposing concept, they needed to invent Eastern Europe, so that Western Europe and Eastern Europe came together, and it's the complementary other half, defining itself by opposition and adjacency in a kind of an Orientalistic way. So Eastern Europe in this structure is what is between Europe and Asia, somehow a borderline. I think this notion, so that Europe proper is really Western Europe, I think it has been with us for quite a long time. Let me pose a very simple question. What do you think is the highest mountain in Europe?
Google says it's in Russia.
Mont Blanc. I think 9 people out of 10 would claim it's Mont Blanc. That's the way I learned at school. Now, Mont Blanc is here. Sorry, here. But actually, Mount Elbrus in the Caucasus is almost 1,000 meters higher than Mont Blanc. Let me check. I'm not a geographist. Mont Blanc is 4,800, I believe. Oh, where is it? And Mount Elbrus in the Caucasus is much, much higher. Yeah, 5,600. And even there are 3 more peaks in the Caucasus which are higher than Mont Blanc. So why do we say Mont Blanc? Because for most people, such an east part as the Caucasus is not part of Europe. Geographically, the Caucasus is the southeastern boundary of Europe. So for a geographist, there's no question, this is part of Europe, this is the boundary. But in our mental maps, that is somewhere else. And so when we talk about Central Europe and Eastern Europe, really what we're having is this mental map that concentrates around Western Europe. What you can see is from a French secondary school history textbook, political map of Europe in the 17th century. What you can see that it actually is political map of Western Europe. You have Vienna is the last thing that is shown here. We have in the east, we have something, the Ottoman Empire and a bit of Poland appears, but it's all blank. What really matters is what is west of Vienna. So that's Europe in the mind of Western Europeans. Most of it is just simply not on the map because it doesn't seem to matter. This, I could give you a lot of examples. Just let me give one. Neville Chamberlain said in 1938 about Czechoslovakia that they are faraway lands of which we know nothing. These faraway lands, unknown somewhere in maybe a jungle, who knows? As an opposing idea to this, says Timothy Garton Ash, the British historian in 1986, that Siberia does not begin at checkpoint Charlie, because in the Western minds, Eastern Europe was somewhere behind the Iron Curtain and unknown and dangerous and very cold and all kinds of things. It's a more complex story than that, but this I think is very, very important for us to understand what Central Europe means, because Central Europe or Mitteleuropa, sometimes used as in the term as Middle Europe also in English, the term came up in the 19th century. French and German geographers started to use it, and it had some kind of importance during the 19th century in the unification of Germany. So Central Europe was often mentioned in this process. And then the late 19th and early 20th century brought a change. Actually, this part of the world came much closer to Western Europe. So there was no such a big difference between Vienna and Budapest any longer. We're very proud that the world's second underground was built in Budapest, the first one in London, the second one in Budapest, then came Paris just only later. So that this dichotomy didn't seem to work any longer until the Second World War, when with the establishment of the Iron Curtain and the Cold War logics set up this very simple dichotomy again, that West and East, and the East is one block, and you can then, you didn't have to debate about the boundaries because you had the Iron Curtain. It was very simple. I have my memories. It took 3 hours to queue at the borderline if you wanted to go to Vienna and things like this. So again, this East and West seem to be very clearly separated and separable. And it started in the 1980s with intellectuals in this region. Perhaps Milan Kundera is the most important, but Pétera Hanáka in Hungary and many others started to talk about Central Europe again. mainly with in the back of the mind, probably to escape this Eastern dominion, the Soviet domination, so that politically, yes, we belong to the Soviet realm and the Warsaw Pact and whatever, but culturally, at least, we are different. This is basically Kundera's definition of Central Europe, that geographically it's in the center of Europe, culturally it is linked to the West, whereas politically it is more to the East. I would like to draw your attention to a Hungarian historian, Jenő Szűcs, who simultaneously with Kundera in 1981 wrote about the 3 historical regions of Europe. You still have Czechoslovakia there because it was published in 81. So basically his argument is that Central Europe clearly was not invented neither in the 19th nor in the 20th century. It existed from the Middle Ages on. He's a historian of medieval studies. Basically, he focuses on the chief patterns of social structuring. And he claims that there is a Western pattern and there is an Eastern pattern. The Western pattern from the Middle Ages on is about autonomies for the lower levels and the control of the power of the sovereigns, and basically preventing the concentration of the power. Think about Magna Carta, for instance. So essentially something like a democratic pattern, not democratic in the present day's values, not that peasants would be asked what they want to do, but clearly spreading power and not concentrating in one hand. So giving counterweights to the methods of subordination. And behind this is the notion of human dignity, that every human has its own dignity. This is essentially a Christian idea. And the king has the same human dignity as the peasant. This was not so much emphasized for many, many centuries, but the nobleman at least had some kind of counterweight. Now, this is the Western pattern, developing obviously into the current plural democracies, but already present in Western Europe from Middle Ages, whereas the Eastern pattern, if you like, the Asian pattern is a lot more about the centralization of power, minimal authorities at lower levels, minimal autonomies at lower levels, and basically a complete subordination of the subjects. That is the Eastern ideal. And what about Central Europe? Central Europe is in between, somehow oscillating between the two, usually moving towards the Western pattern, but very often drawing back towards the Eastern pattern. In Hungary, we keep experiencing this in these times. So that's Szűcs's argument. And if that was very, very complex and complicated, I have a simpler way of presenting it. On the left, this is the idea of the boss in Germany. So one amongst the others, a little higher than the others, but roughly the same size. The other one is the boss in China, superhuman, completely different than the others. I'm not sure what happens here in the Institute of. You're definitely higher than taller than most of them, but maybe not that much. So you see. By the way, this is a Chinese artist's work, Yang Liu, who was born in Beijing and moved to Germany. When I talk about East in this context, I don't mean China that much. I more what is more relevant for this region, that is Russia in the north and Turkey in the south, and the Ottoman Empire and so on. But so these are the social backgrounds. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to a very interesting book from a few years ago, published by John Connelly. Basically, he talks about Eastern Europe rather than Central Europe, so I don't agree in every point. But what is very important for him, is that this region had experienced history, especially in the 20th century, much more intensely than more other regions. And this comes together with the ideas of Timothy Snyder, who talks about the bloodlands. For him, this region is the bloodlands where the most people died in the 20th century and in the Second World War. Think about Holocaust, which happened mostly in our area, Holodomor, and also the greatest and most bloodiest battles in the 20th century were also more or less in our region. Snyder goes a little bit more to the east as well, but so that's the special intensity of history, and also the great differences. So if we go back to the map, you can see that this is not a very large area, but we're talking about 16 to 18 countries, depending on where we're drawing the boundaries, and roughly as many, even more nations. So that it's a very complex area. And also that the notion of nation is very, very important. Nation and nationality. Also with the idea, which comes up in this region pretty often, that the nation could disappear. We have to be careful because our nation could disappear. It could be devoured by an empire, and we could completely disappear. This is something that doesn't really happen in Western Europe. This notion that I don't know. I don't believe that the Germans ever worried about their nation disappearing. If you think about it, it's quite interesting that during the Marxist communist times, which is officially international, in reality, most of the communist parties were very strongly nationalistic. Romanian Communist Party was very, very strongly nationalistic, for instance. Not all of them. The East German was not so much, but the nationalist idea was strongly present. Okay, now I'd like to, moving a little bit towards the utopian area, I'd like to look at how this in-betweenness between East and West of Central Europe appears in the self-definitions of Central European nations, or at least in their historians and literary historians. So let me give you a few examples, starting with Romania. So Eugen Lovinescu in 1925 writes that the Romanian nation is at the boundary of two worlds, East and West. So that's so far confirming my thesis. Basically, he points at the Latin mentality and the Byzantine mentality, and definitely for him, the Western mentality is much more important. He claims that the Romanian nation exists, and the Romanian nation comes into existence with its relationship to the West, going as far as saying that from the perspective of our place, that is Romania, the light comes from the West. Okay, so East and West terribly important, and West having a clear reference here. Károly Kós, the Hungarian architect and artist, in the same era, writing about Transylvania, so the western part of present-day Romania, talks about the same issues in a slightly different light. So Transylvania is a threshold between Eastern and Western Europe. If you don't know what's a threshold, that's what you can step over when you want to enter a room. All the cultural currents flowing from west to east or the other way stumbled and left something behind. So from times immemorial, this land has been the melting pot of peoples and faiths, races and cultures. Basically, he defines multiculturalism here. My Canadian friends believe that they invented multiculturalism. I think it existed centuries before in this area, particularly in Transylvania, but I think in most of Central Europe. But what you can find that for Kós, East and West, none of them it's not a hierarchy. It's a richness of culture that gives a special flavor to this area. Okay, let's move to I think you know him better than me, Ladislav Novomeský, writing about Slovak culture in the 30s. This is the first sentence of the treatise, placed on the crossroads of Western and Eastern influences. So for him, this is also of central importance. And he also claims that Slovak culture is a synthesis of Western sophistication and Eastern universal human desires, the blending of East and West. Again, for him, it's, I'm sorry, this blending, this hybridity is what is important and what makes the Slovak culture of especially interesting. For him, the East was not so negative, mainly because of his communist ideas. If we go a little bit further to the north, in the Czechs, Josef Pekář talks about the meaning of Czech history, still thinking in this East-West axis, but quite differently. So he says that the Czech and the Slavs as general were bearers of a high culture, a culture higher than their Germanic neighbor to the west. That's a very big change from the Romanian idea. So now the East has the upper point in the hierarchy. And that's the contact and conflict of two worlds, a world of freedom, good and peace, that is to say, the world of democracy on the Slavic side, whereas the world of dominion, force, oppression, that is to say, the world of feudalism on the Germanic. Right? So again, conflict and combination of two cultures where the Eastern, in this sense, the Slavic is the more positive. In a way, a similar notion comes from Serbian Ljubomir Micic, who in his avant-garde movement called Zenitism in the 1920s, again emphasizes that the Balkans, he focuses on the Balkans rather than the whole Central Europe, as the bridge between the East and the West. But let's be guards against the West. So he's very much in looking at the Western culture as the degenerate culture, basically something negative with its pure rationalism, with its capitalism and formalism and perversions and decadence. Whereas from the East comes purity, good-heartedness, and a masculine power, a healthy barbarian blood that young Yugoslavia could bring into the West with the and rejuvenating this. So you can see that a number of notions appear always in this Eastern and Western dichotomy, and already showing some kind of utopian notions as well. I notice in basically all of them pretty strongly in Pekář and also here in Zenitism, that the West could learn something from the East. So now, in the last part of my talk, I would like to give you a little bit about the history of Central European utopianism. But now I have to jump back in time to some earlier parts. Already in the 16th century, the reception of Thomas More's Utopia began in Central Europe. There were some works which show some kind of utopian aspects, but really the first one that is very important, that's usually referred to, is Johannes Comenius's or Jan Kamensky's The Labyrinth of the World and the Paradise of the Heart from 1623, even though I myself don't really consider it as mainly as a utopian work. It's essentially a very complex and very spectacular satire or satirical allegory of human existence in the 17th century, with some kind of utopian aspect in the end. In the end, is the highest level of existence are the true Christians who live in a real relationship with God, and they really find their peace in their internal life. So external life is always problematic. You cannot find happiness anywhere, not in wealth, not in joys, not even in scholarship. That's a pity, but that's what Comenius says. But only in your internal life, and a life of the true Christians is peace and harmony. So that you can consider as a utopian notion. But there's another writing by him called Gentis Felicitas, The Happiness of the Nation, much later when he lived in Transylvania. He wrote essentially, this is a 40-50 page long treatise for the Prince of Transylvania, George Rákóczi, whom had a pretty negative fate after all, but a lot of hopes were attached to him at that time. And basically, here Comenius explains how a nation could be happy. And first of all, he describes, defines what a nation is, underlying my notion that in Central Europe, even utopia, nation is so important that even utopias tend to be national. Most of Western European utopias are non-national or international. So people from the same root live at the same place and speak the same language. They have a solidarity and they work for the common good. So that defines their community. And he also has 18 markers of felicitas or happiness. They're pretty practical. Like there should be well-populated good lands with good laws and wise elders, and everybody should work properly, eating their own bread and not taking others' goods. It's actually a very modest utopia, and that's another other feature of most Central European utopias. They are modest, they're not eccentric. Western European utopias very often imagine something completely different. And what Comenius says, and later Bessenyei will say the same, is that if people respect the laws, including the kings, that's very important, then life will be good. And it's also very important that a leader is needed who is kin to those whom he rules, not an external leader, not from an empire, especially not a German and not a Turkish, but somebody from us. That's again a recurring practice. So the importance of the leader. And then the result of good laws and public safety will be prosperity and happiness. So that's Comenius from the 17th century. And I'd like to move on to the Polish Ignacy Krasicki from the 18th century. He is one of the most important, or probably the most important writer of Polish Enlightenment. He wrote actually this book, The Adventures of Mr. Nicholas Wisdom. It's available in English. Luckily for me, please don't try to make me pronounce the Polish title. It is a very much this kind of travel literature in the sense of Fielding, Rousseau, Voltaire, but Swift is relevant here. So a lot of Western European traditions are present. Nikolai travels first in Poland. He experiences what life in Poland is. Then he moves on to Western Europe. And the second book is a larger travel where he gets into an island. The island is called Nipu. Nipu is interesting if you know Greek, that might be understood as nowhere, something like that. So it might also be a place of utopia, but that's only speculation. But clearly it's utopian in the sense that they live very, very differently from the Europeans, from Polish and Western Europeans alike. Because private property is strictly limited here. They have an egalitarian society. It's based on the idea that we are all the children of one father, and therefore we are all equal. So it's a very strongly national, or even if you like, a tribalistic society. They all pacifists and vegetarian. There's no sin because there are no laws to define sin. They don't use money. They also don't use iron, for instance. So they're very, very different from both Poland, which was described as something very corrupted, and also from Western Europe, which is described as a lavish and prodigal country. They are much more frugal and much more sparing. Actually, these are the qualities which in the 21st century become very important in the face of the climate emergency. The goal of education in Nipu is to learn virtue. they don't really deal with writing. They prefer to learn in stories which are orally told, and basically they have to reach some kind of inner conviction about the good virtues, the basis of which is the respect of the other, and also a very strong cohesion amongst Nippons. They also a bit they're pretty isolationist as well. Now, from a political point of view, it's quite interesting because there's no real hierarchy in Nippu. The elders are leading though, but they lead because they have the experience and they should be able to persuade the others. So they don't lead by their authority, but their ability to persuade the others what they should do. And if there's just one person ruling, that's considered something really awful. So the authority is a problematic issue. And essentially the political structure is so simple that I wouldn't call it a political utopia. It's more like a cultural utopia. It's a utopia of a specific culture. The last book I would like to mention is the Hungarian György Bessenyei's The Voyage of Tariménes, some decades after Krasicki. Bessenyei is also a very important figure in Hungarian Enlightenment. And this book is one he wrote when he was pretty mature. This is a summary of his ideas, also a very complex book, something very difficult to read, partly because it wasn't properly published. Habsburg censorship didn't allow the publication. The first publication came in the 1930s, so more than 120 years after it was finished, and up until today it's not very easily available. There is one critical edition, but it's hard to read, and generally it's a book hard to read because its structure is pretty complicated. Nevertheless, it includes a lot of very interesting ideas. So somehow a summary of his life and a summary of his experiences in the Habsburg monarchy. And so Tariménes is the young hero who goes to the country which is called Totopos. And Totopos is a country where one can rise without repressing the other, and where the common good is something very important. It's probably very much the opposite of what the writer experienced in contemporary Hungary. It's a hierarchical society, but it is very strongly cohesive. People belong together, that's emphasized. And it's all centered around the figure of the queen who is called Arténis, and in many ways he resembles Maria Theresa, in whose court in Vienna Bessenyei lived and had a very good life. But there are also significant differences, especially that it's emphasized that Arténis is a national queen. Arténis belongs to the same nation. And Arténis respects the laws and also the will of her people, just as Comenius said that the respect of the laws is the center of the well-being of the society. That's the same case in Bessenyei. It is also a fairly moderate utopia of a good government by a good queen and well-applicable laws. What is interesting is that the book includes also a dystopian structure. The neighboring country called Jajgádia, which is in Hungarian, it's a quite witty phrase. It's a kind of I would translate it as the land of sorrows, which has a despotic ruler, and this despotic ruler creates an atmosphere of fear. So everybody is afraid, people don't dare to talk to each other. The law is really the king's word, and if the king says something else tomorrow, that there will be the next law. And also it's very interesting, a description of the capital of this city tells you that people walk in the streets, but they don't talk to each other because they are afraid they might say something that will be dangerous for them. So it's very different from Totopos. And finally, actually, so Iaigadia tries to invade Totopos, but the opposite happens. Totopos will invade Iaigadia, and then Artenish claims that she doesn't want to rule this country because she comes from a different nation. So they need their own ruler. They need to elect their own ruler, and it's not easy because when the assembly is called together, everybody is only concentrating on their own individual interest. So they cannot get to an agreement. So this cohesion is missing. The notion of the common good is missing in this dystopian country. So finally, they managed to do something, but it's kind of complicated. Okay, so these were the three examples that I think represent pretty well at least this earlier tradition of utopianism in Central Europe. And as a last thing, I would just give you a very quick summary of what I said. So really in this, the utopia in Central, or rather I'd say this is the East Central European utopia, is this in-betweenness between East and West, especially from a political and social point of view, which is emphatic for most writers. Very often, though not always, this moderateness. So utopia is something which is somewhat better than what we live in, but it's not necessarily drastically or eccentrically different. The national traits are pretty important, especially in comparison to Western European utopianism, and also leadership, with the exception of Krasicki. Of course, leadership is something of central importance. A good life depends on a good leader. That would be a simple statement about it. And also the last point is that I cannot just give you a very simple definition of East Central European utopianism because it is complex and varied. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to a discussion with you.